In today's episode, we'll drill down to a relatively unknown battle from July 1944 that reveals much about the fierce fighting in the Normandy campaign, about the Battle of La Haye-du-Puits.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. And if we have viewers here, you can see it's not just the two of us, but because we have a guest again, a real expert on this battle that I mentioned in this French town, in the French village. And we're drilling in as a part of the Normandy campaign that we haven't really looked at yet in the podcast, which you might say is quite strange, isn't it? In some ways, well, we haven't touched on yet. We need to do it. So, dear listeners and viewers, prepare yourself for a 15-part super series on the Normandy campaign. But we start with a particular episode. So, Jesse, I'm going to throw it over to you so you could introduce Paul to our listeners and viewers.
Yes, we're coming into Normandy through the back door, let's say, not through the most famous element of the Normandy campaign. And we're very glad to welcome to the podcast our guest for today, Paul Woodadge, who some of you listeners and viewers out there might know if you're into World War II on YouTube, for example. Paul is the host of the World War II TV channel on YouTube, which has an almost infinite number of in-depth interviews with various authors on all sorts of aspects of World War II. It's a great online repository if you want to procrastinate your remaining years on this earth away on YouTube. But that's not the only thing that Paul is known for. I think in the history community, he's also an accomplished battlefield guide in Normandy. And so this is why we reached out and invited you, Paul, to talk to us about the Normandy campaign. And I'm glad that we're gonna focus on something that's a little off the beaten path. At least it was for me, which is this engagement with the Americans at a place called La Haye-du-Puits. That's my Quebec accent coming out. I suppose the locals in Normandy would probably pronounce it slightly differently.
So non-European.
There you go.
So non-European.
They'd have about 5 different ways of pronouncing it, probably. That's how I find here. I say a village name to one person village, and they look at me with congratulations, and the other person shakes their head and go, "No, you completely mangled that." So I go, "Well, so what chance does that give me if you can't agree?"
Well, we'll try and make some sense of it in any case. So, to get the ball rolling here, Paul, what's the context? So this place is in Normandy. This battle's a part of the Normandy campaign. It's in July. Takes place in the first half of July. So bring us up to speed. What's going on in Normandy at that point? We all know the invasion takes place, or the landings take place on the 6th of June. But there's a gap here until we get into our topic for today. So what are things looking like?
So I always break down the Normandy campaign into sort of 3 phases: beachhead, attrition, and breakout. Okay. And the breakout has always been understood to be basically Operations Cobra and Bluecoat. That's when it all begins. And then you get the Falaise Gap. And within a couple of weeks, really, the campaign is over. But I'd always found it a bit frustrating as to when exactly the breakout phase began, because it's not like the attritional phase just sort of ended at a certain hour and minute. It was sort of transitional. And there are signs of things changing for maybe a week or two before Operation Cobra begins. And it was that period that I got really interested in. And so I'm sort of starting at the end of my book before I go back to the beginning of my book. So Operation Cobra begins towards the end of July on the road between Saint-Lô to the sort of southeast and the road up to the sort of the northwest of Perrier. But if you carry on the road from Perrier, you get to the town of Lessay, and Lessay sits a few miles south of La Haye-du-Puits. Now, for years and years and years, this historiography has suggested that the Operation Cobra breakout begins from the Saint-Lô battlefield, because it is at one end of this starting line road. And Lessay, and then further up the road, La Haye-du-Puits is at the other end of this road. But it got me thinking about what causes General Bradley particularly to set into motion the Operation Cobra planning. And I think all the focus has been on what's been happening in the Saint-Lô sector prior to Operation Cobra. But actually, until July the 11th, so a couple of weeks before Cobra, there hadn't been much happening in Saint-Lô for 2 or 3 weeks because it had got a bit bogged down there. But more importantly, this is where we kind of bring up to the beginning of La Haye-du-Puits. The Americans have got to finish off the taking of the Cherbourg Peninsula, the Cotentin, by moving up from Utah up to Cherbourg, all of which takes longer than they're anticipating, because essentially everything takes longer in Normandy than they're anticipating, the seizing of Caen, the seizing of Saint-Lô, etc., etc. And once they've taken Cherbourg, which is towards the end of June, they've then got to fight their way back down the peninsula again. So that no one likes fighting for the same area twice. And so they've fought north going up the Cherbourg, and then they've taken Cherbourg. And the harbour, by the way, was not in good enough condition to be used, which was essentially the whole idea of the Utah Beach landings, the seizing of a deep water harbour in Cherbourg. And they get there and it can be used, but not to the level they want it to be. Anyway, by this point, the Germans have got a defensive line across the Cotentin that's called the Malmen line, after General Malmen. And the Malmen line runs sort of directly through La Haye-du-Puits. It runs through the area around La Haye-du-Puits, which is about hills, and we'll get to that later on. They're fighting down the peninsula takes almost as long as it did to go up the peninsula, which means all over to the east in the Saint-Lô area, there's no real need for a breakout south, because they can't go until the army over to the west has come down in line enough to be ready to move in a concerted effort. So things have quietened down in the Saint-Lô sector by early July. At the same time, things have sort of been speeding up a little bit in the British sector, because Operation Charnwood in early July has meant that the British and Canadians have finally seized the city. And more importantly, some of the areas sort of around the city, so they can think about expanding south and building airfields and all that kind of stuff, and bringing their artillery groups over, which was sort of the whole point of Caen in some ways, is to build up a massive great force there. And I realize I've got quite a few plates spinning now. I hope you guys and the viewers are following all this.
Well, let's take a minute here, if I may. Let's just take a minute. Yeah. For those imagining this scenario out there, listening and viewing, by the start of July, the Normandy campaign has developed, Paul, as you said, I think a little not quite as planned. I mean, it's not going terrible for the Allies, obviously, but it's not quite as planned. So there's been some delays getting as far inland as they would have liked in the British and Canadian sector. The Americans go up, as you mentioned, this Cotentin Peninsula, which is next to the Normandy beaches. It's just west of them, and it has this port. And the famous breakout comes at Saint-Lô, but if I understand correctly, they are trying to clear let's say, the far western part of the line in this area where La Haye-du-Puits is located. It's almost on the Atlantic coast, essentially, or it is basically on the Atlantic coast, right? So this is kind of, as far as I've understood in my preliminary readings and listening to you, this is sort of a part of setting up for what is eventually the big famous breakout at Saint-Lô, which is Operation Cobra, right?
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, the landing beaches run east-west, although Utah goes around the corner to be running north-south. But eventually, if we're projecting to the taking down of Germany, the invasion force has to be in a north-south line to move easterly towards Germany. So Caen, as Montgomery sort of famously alluded to, is the hinge for which the Allied army can then swing round under, the Americans being over to the west, which are slightly more mechanized, have more armored divisions. Theoretically, they can move a bit faster. I don't actually agree with all that stuff, but that's the principle. And then they can all move off north-south. But at this point, by the end of June, they haven't even got a left east-west line inland of the beaches, because they're still stuck up in the peninsula towards Cherbourg. And the terrain there is very mixed. I mean, around Cherbourg itself, it's not mountainous, but it's quite steep. There's sort of escarpments and things like that. Lots of defenses around it. because obviously the Germans were heavily defending the port. And although the Atlantic Wall itself has been kind of bypassed by landing further to the east, the German garrison around Cherbourg is still pretty strong. Even at the point when the American divisions are closing in, they've still got a lot of firepower they can bring to bear, especially, weirdly, the later built Atlantic Wall positions where the guns aren't in fixed emplacements. It means they can turn them around and point them south, as opposed to ones in the fixed emplacements could only point out to sea or laterally. So weirdly, their own inefficiency has sort of given them an advantage there, if that isn't a weird concept. But to go back to the point of why I wanted to talk about this subject is that I was starting to look at what was happening, particularly around July the 4th. So US Independence Day, weirdly, because on that day, which in the traditional narrative is when things are building up in the Saint-Lô sector for a renewed offensive on July the 11th that then takes places like Hill 192, the American 2nd Division push out towards Saint-Lô, etc., etc. On July the 4th, the press corps, now, okay, that's the press, but the press corps are over camps north of La Haye-du-Puits. Eisenhower is near La Haye-du-Puits on July the 4th. Bradley is in La Haye-du-Puits on July the 4th. General Gavin and Ridgway of the 82nd Airborne, because their divisions in there, are in the area around La Haye-du-Puits. So when General Bradley goes into his tent, essentially, to put together Operation Cobra, the events that are freshly in his mind are what he has just seen at La Haye-du-Puits, because he goes and starts writing down Cobra about sort of July 7th, 6th, 7th, 8th. It's one of those things where he doesn't sort of open a diary and say, starting on this big plan today. It's sort of a slight...
as one would normally do.
Yeah, it's sort of the idea has been percolating, and then when he clears his space on his desk, clears his agenda from recording podcasts about Normandy invasion, and he sits down and he writes his Operation Cobra brief, he has been in the area of La Haye-du-Puits. Now, again, the losses of the American 8th Corps taking that La Haye-du-Puits area and these hills are astronomical. I mean, we're talking about 5,000 casualties in 48 hours for a corps, pretty much. The 90th Division are coming in from sort of the east, north towards La Haye-du-Puits, and they, if your viewers know anything about that, Eisenhower refers to the American 90th Division as the problem division. It's to do with leadership at the general's level. And they go through about 4 commanders in as many months, sort of. Then the 82nd Airborne, who've done so well on June the 6th and taken all those objectives, they're coming in from sort of the northeast towards La Haye-du-Puits. They didn't go actually up towards Cherbourg first. They just carried on pushing westerly across the Cotentin. And then the American 79th Division, which nobody ever talks about, who are pushing in sort of from the north. They had been up towards Cherbourg, and they fight for Bloody Hill 84 on Montgardon, which is just to the west of La Haye-du-Puits, and that is one of the 5 canonical French 5 hills. And the losses there are absolutely staggering. So the point I'm trying to make, and we can get to terrain and things like that and expand on that in a minute, is that it's the La Haye-du-Puits fighting that is really influencing Bradley's need to do something really dynamic to change the balance of power in Normandy. Because as you said, Jesse, it's not that the Normandy campaign, well, both of you, it's not that the Normandy campaign is going badly. I mean, it's essentially doing what it's supposed to do. It's wearing down the German army. It's just that it's not quite moving at the pace. And the lines aren't quite as sort of sorted out as they would like. And they need to get a bit of order in. And you cannot sustain, given how far Germany is away from Normandy, if a corps is going to be losing 5,000 casualties every 48 hours, you're going to run out of guys before you get anywhere near the Seine River. And I think that's the crisis point that gets Bradley to think about it. So that's kind of where we are with my thinking.
I think you just said the key word for me here, being good German, putting on the German head, order. So let's get some order into this discussion, because that's very good. So let's zoom in a little bit now that we've set the scene and looked at where the place is, where is La Haye-du-Puits, why is it important, the greater context which makes this whole place so important, not only for the fighting there, but as you've just explained, for the wider planning and the wider conduct of the Normandy campaign. So let's start to zoom in now. And you also said the other important word, and of course that's terrain. Previously you talked about defensive line, the Germans holding them. And normally, of course, when you defend a position, well, there are two reasons why you normally choose a defensive position. First one, because you have to, because you're under pressure and you just stand and fight where you have to. But following everything that you said, that the Allies go to the Cotentin first and towards Cherbourg before they then come down again. So that, you might say, gives the Germans arguably the time to prepare a defensive line where they want to have the defensive line. So maybe let's talk about this. So what is the terrain like? Does it favor the defender? And all of these, probably also the famous bokage we need to mention at some stage. So all of that. So I'll throw it over to you again.
Right. So it essentially it favors the defender, but only to a certain point, and they are very aware of that certain point. And what favors them is they can see everything from miles off, because these hills, which aren't covered in trees, so the hills near Saint-Lô are heavily wooded, or if they're not wooded, they are with the absolute typical 50-yard apart bokage hedgerows. So there's no vision from Hill 192 across to Saint-Lô and Martinville Ridge, for example. But on the couple of hills that are north of La Haye-du-Puits, you can stand there on a clear day and you can see the church tower at Saint-Marie-de-Mont, just inland from Utah Beach, one direction, and you can see the Channel Islands in the other direction. So you can basically see across the entire Cotentin. And a Roman general, a legend had stood there in whatever year it was, defending it against Asterix and Obelix, if you read your cartoon books.
Clearly,
and had seen that same terrain thing there. And basically the Germans don't have many people there. What they do have, though, is a really, really good aerial spotting system for their artillery. They have observers there. They have telephone lines. In one of the hills that the 82nd fight over, we think, because 82nd basically found nobody there, we think that the 4 or 5 guys manning the artillery, the observation, relaying, blah, 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 just basically hid in trees and let the Americans go past, and then kind of promptly went back up to their position and started transmitting again once Americans have gone. I think the Americans were thinking that they were going to find, dozens of battalions or whatever, but they didn't. Between the hills are long causeway type roads that have floods and marshes either side. There's also floods to the east of La Haye-du-Puits, which the way the 7th Corps are coming from Carenton. So, and then between the causeways and the floods and the hills, you have little bits of very thick bocage. There's a little bit of everything. And then over to the western side of the coast, where now if people are traveling to Normandy this summer and they want to drive down the coast, you've got these amazing seaside villages like Port-Bail and Carteret and places like that. There's a lovely coastal road, maybe a mile inland from the beaches, that takes you down past all these lovely little seaside resorts with churches. That road didn't exist in World War II. There were only roads running from the high ground across the little fishing villages, but not a connecting one going north-south. So the Americans have to fight their way down through little sort of back street village roads through hedgerows, which either takes them into country which they can't move through, or into the open where they're under observation from the Germans from these high ground. Now, the complications anyone knows, as you two guys know in your researching, is the researching of the German elements, because you have the core level archives to some extent, and you have some survivor testimonies, but not very many, but you don't sort of have divisional and, a lower down archives. And particularly the division that was making a life problematic for the Americans was the 2nd Panzer SS Das Reich. But Das Reich are not fighting as a division. They're being fought in penny packets. There's basically not much in the way of archives about what they're doing and why they're doing it and where they're doing it. But it's essentially Das Reich's artillery that is near the Laissay area that is being controlled by the observers on these hills, and some artillery elements from the German 243rd Division, which was the sort of static infantry division that also has connection to some artillery positions around the coast. But to go back to your question about the position being defendable, the problem is it's in danger of the whole bit being cut off. If the Americans coming in from Carenton, the 7th Corps, who are moving further south, could race across to the western coast below La Haye-du-Puits, Ongoville-sur-A is one of the kind of villages there, that anything the Germans have around these hills could be cut off. So the Germans have a really good position until it gets to the point where they're in danger of being surrounded and cut off. And then it becomes a very, very, very bad position. And the Americans, everything they say, everything they do is under observation. The other key factor, I think, which isn't terrain-based, but it is very relevant to this, is that the 82nd Airborne, for example, who are attacking Hill 95, which is the lowest of the hills and not one of the canonical 5, are absolutely on their last legs by early part of July, because they have been at it since June the 6th. No replacement platoon leaders and platoon sergeants, that kind of stuff. Everybody is overworked, overexhausted. I mean, 3rd Battalion 508th, on the morning of the attack on Hill 95, which is Independence Day, 3rd Battalion go through 4 commanders in about 4 hours. One is killed, one is wounded, then the next one is made commander, and then the wounded guy comes back for a few minutes, then the guy who was made commander gets relieved of command at the end, 4 hours later. Now, you tell me how a unit can be efficiently running when it's going through 4 commanders in the morning. And it's no one's fault, really. It's just everyone's absolutely, to use a bit of English vernacular, knackered.
I think that topic is one for me that also connects to the ground over which the fighting is taking place, because the bokage makes getting a picture of the battlefield and what's happening much more difficult. So anybody who's familiar with the Normandy campaign has come across this idea of bokage and what it is and how it works. But for the newbies out there, and we love you newbies, you're more than welcome on our podcast, of course. Take us through what is bokage or hedgerows when we hear this in respect to the Normandy campaign. Because La Haye-du-Puits, yes, it's kind of on the edge of Normandy, on the coast. It has this unusual kind of swamps. There's a couple of rivers there. But it does have bokage. So, Paul, can you take us through the layman's version of what is this bokage thing that we talk about in Normandy and that makes it so much harder to attack through?
Yeah, and I will say that I didn't realize how much bokage this area had until I started working on my book a couple of years ago. I would regularly go through La Haye-du-Puits because it's on my route to my wife's favorite town on the western coast of Barneville-Carteret, where we go to just walk on the beach and be romantic and that kind of stuff. And I always thought that part was not very bokage, which isn't a word, but I use the word bokage because
I like it.
Why the hell not?
Sure, I like it too.
But actually, it is quite bokage there. So bokage, in a nutshell, it's just how the French have been farming for millennia, basically. Some people say it goes back to the Romans and their cultivation of the area when it was primarily forested, and they start cutting it back. And it's not so much the hedges themselves; it's the earth banks out of which they grow. And so you get these, you might want to call them sunken lanes that vehicles and horses and wagons have been using literally for hundreds of years. And Normandy is very, very wet for France. And so for generations, these wagons have been going up and down, and cattle and horses up and down these tracks. And it's just worn the tracks lower and lower and lower. And the mud at the base from the wheels gets flung up the bases of the hedgerows. And often you're standing in a lane where the person in the field, if you send one of your party up into the field, he's 6 foot higher than you because the field is that much higher than the lane in between. It is the trees that grow out of the earth banks, but it's the earth banks themselves, which can be anything from sort of 6 foot wide for the smaller ones up to sort of 12 foot, 15 foot wide. And there are some I go down that are, the earth bank is twice the height of me, and I'm 6 foot. So it's 12 foot of earth bank before you even get to the trees on top. And then what happens is, I'm going to some geekiness now, is that the maps the Americans and British are mostly using, hedgerows are just marked as green lines, right? And that green line could be like a little strip of like shrubs you buy out of a garden center, or it could be one of these sunken lanes that is an arterial route that the Germans can use to move their units around with these 12-foot earth banks and trees on top. And until you kind of get there, you don't know what you're going to face, which is why the Allies have switched by late June to relying far more on aerial photos than they are on the maps, because the aerial photos although not perfect, because you can't really sense the depth of the sunken lanes, you can certainly get an idea of the thickness. And the shadows being cast, for example, by the trees can give you an idea of, okay, that's a big mother we've got there, or that one's a little one there. But, and this is a key thing about the terrain of La Haye-du-Puits, so I would urge, if anyone's thinking of visiting these hills where they think, oh, we heard him say about this hill where you can stand and you can see the Channel Islands and Sainte Marie de Mort. Yeah, fine, if the weather's good. I don't claim to understand how the weather works, and I'm not a meteorologist, but what happens with these 5 hills and the fact there's 2 bodies of water either side is it just seems to always be foggier and grayer and cloudier there than it is somewhere else. Because as you guys know, the further you get into the Normandy campaign, the more air power becomes a defining factor of what the Allies can and can't do. You know, as soon as the 2nd Tactical Air Force and the 9th Air Force, all that can bring over their stuff, and the Allies are, building airfields every day, fantastic. And that was really helping things over to the east. But at the pivotal time of this battle, last week of June, first week of July, they can barely get any aircraft off the ground. Well, they can get them off the ground. They can't get them over the La Haye-du-Puits area because it's too socked in with fog. So there's a limited amount of aerial photos coming through. And when I'm taking people there to these causeway roads, I'm showing the Germans were over there, and people are saying, why the hell aren't we just using air power to dislodge those Germans? The problem is it can't fly in here. And there's a hell of a lot going on elsewhere in Normandy. Last week of June, first week of July, that everyone wants air power. The British are doing Charnwood. There's a movement coming out from the eastern flank, the airborne sector. There's still the build up in the Saint-Lô area. And in fact, I'm kind of connecting threads here. One of the mysteries, the few people that have written about the La Haye-du-Puits battle in the past, John McManus devoted a chapter to it in his Americans at Normandy book about 10 years ago, is there's been a bit of a mystery as to why the Das Reich division, who, as I said, aren't fighting as a division, but they are getting orders from corps level, don't take advantage of the situation they're finding themselves in and actually kind of move in and annihilate these American forces heading for the La Haye-du-Puits, because they don't fully, thank God, they don't fully take advantage of the situation that they got themselves in. Das Reich are paranoid about something really big happening in the Saint-Lô area.
With good reason.
It eventually does happen, because they've kind of got it right. So they're not putting in more people into the La Haye-du-Puits area because they're worried about something else bigger later.
So I'm just thinking, because there's a lot going on there, isn't there? A lot of things happening. The Germans looking at this saying, well, yes, there is stuff happening. We're not going to go all in because there is more happening somewhere else, which might be a bit more important. So you can see this is the operational picture. We talked about the strategic picture. We're already beginning to talk about the tactics, the different units being deployed. The terrain, you mentioned that. The weather, I think that's something that we quite often tend to forget and overlook. We say, well, it's June, so of course it's warm and hot and sunny. It's a little bit like, I don't know, if we go to the First World War, you look at Third Ypres, there was mud everywhere. No, there wasn't. So these factors are really, really important, aren't they? I think you're absolutely right. And I think now that we've established all this and basically got the map in front of us, so to speak, with the hills as well, defensive lines, bokage, I think now we really need to talk about the troops that we've got there. You already mentioned some of these. You talked about Das Reich. You talked about some of the SS divisions. I think it might be really useful for the listeners and viewers who are not experts on this, because everyone talking about Normandy looks at the beaches, and that is pretty much, isn't it? Maybe an American paratrooper dangling from a church tower.
Don't get me started on that. Oh, good grief.
But this one is so different. It's just quite well geographically as well over there on the left, isn't it? That probably most people don't know too much about. So maybe run us through the forces that are being used there on both the Allied side, the Americans, and also the Germans. So starting quite big and then zooming in, so we get a good understanding of what we're actually facing.
I mean, the German unit that's in the area is the 243rd Division, and the Germans, there's often a false understanding that the Germans send divisions in when they take France in 1940, and they basically sit there for 4 years, and then the invasion happens. Well, no, they're being rotated and moved and rebuilt and things like that, and divisions are being broken up to reinforce other divisions that are suffering on the Eastern Front, etc., etc., etc. But the 243rd are one of those divisions that are hard to actually kind of break down, because the way we talk about these, you guys know this, is that they either have to be elite or hopeless. And the reality is most German units are neither. They're not elite, but neither are they hopeless. So the 243rd are one of those pretty much kind of bog standard, reasonably well trained. There's some foreigners, there's some older guys, but they're all right. But they really haven't had to face anything since June the 6th. So they are at full strength for a typical understrength division on the German front line in 1944, if that doesn't sound like a contradiction in terms, but you know what I mean. They've also got quite an arsenal of, or backup of the Widerstandsnetz and Stützpoints sort of getting towards the other side of the Cotentin, going down towards Brittany, really, which of course haven't faced an invasion, but they're still garrisoned. They still have German troops there. So one of the accounts I'm using is from an artillery officer. He was a sergeant. I think he gets promoted to an officer during this battle, who's down near San Marlo, which is, on first glance, is quite a long way away from this battle. But when you look at a map, it's not that far. And he's in charge of artillery positions in that area there, which gives the Germans a bit of a sort of an advantage. And these observers they have on the hills can call upon artillery quite some distance away to give them some support. And you've got the Fallschirmjäger. And the Fallschirmjäger are a mixed bag, again, as all German units are in Normandy. But the 15th Fallschirmjäger Regiment have found themselves in a really defendable position. If ever you stand on Moncastre, Hill 121, even though it's heavily wooded today, and one of the sort of mic drop moments I had in my research is that I've been reading the accounts of the 90th Division fighting for this hill, and I've been reading about them, Germans hiding behind trees. And I've been to Moncastre myself many times, and so I pictured this very heavily wooded environment as it is now. When I acquired the May and early June aerial photos from Scotland, that you guys are aware of, I realized the Germans actually cleared most of that hilltop for timber, I assume either for shoring up concrete on bunkers or for beach obstacles. I assume. I don't know where the wood went, but it's like, oh, hang on, that hill is actually quite open. There's scrub and there's tree stumps. Anyway, it's a great area to defend. And the Germans know that. The American 90th Division, and it is pretty much a division, are attacking a hill upon which an understrength Fallschirmjäger regiment sits. So at the very minimum, the Americans have like 3 or 4 to 1 numerical superiority. But when you add all the assets of the American corps artillery, the corps engineers, etc., the Americans on paper outnumber the Germans there, considerably, which I think is why when you read the reports of the 8th Corps coming down from Cherbourg in the days before this battle kind of kicks off, there seems to be no sense of, oh, hang on, we've got that area with the hills coming up. That might be a bit dodgy. There's no real sense of that. Their intel is telling them there aren't many Germans there, which isn't incorrect, actually. The 8th Corps have successfully taken Cherbourg. They're getting to grips with bokage. They're getting to grips with combined arms. They get all that kind of stuff there. But I think they rather dismiss the threat the Germans pose. And then this artillery observation they have just is their ace. It's their ace up their sleeve. And the attritional phase morphing into the breakout phase is that in some ways the big problem the Allies have, and the British are facing this as well to the east, is how they can make their numerical superiority count. Because you've got to get, it's like the Hergenwald or something like that. You've got to get your forces in there. And if you've got to get all your army down a single road with floods either side, you having more men, it's Thermopylae, isn't it, essentially? So the Americans are struggling to make their numerical superiority count. So what they're trying to do is kind of compensate by on-the-ground thinking. And one of the units I'm writing about, which I haven't mentioned, is the 83rd Tank Destroyer unit coming down the western coast, who are doing everything except tank destroying. Being a Brit, I don't like to give the Americans much credit in the Normandy campaign, because I feel it's the British who've been taking the bashing.
Ooh, those are fighting words. Those are fighting words.
So I kind of naturally want to defend what the British and Canadians
do.
The
podcast does not necessarily share the opinions of all its guests. Just right now, go ahead.
Very good.
we all know the fact is that the British and Canadians are dealing with 85% of the German armor over in the east. There has never been a line of armor thicker than the German armor south of Caen in the middle part of the Normandy campaign. But the Americans are quite good at being inventive. And the 83rd Tank Destroyers they're doing sort of hedgerow clearing with their vehicles. They're doing indirect fire, direct fire. Their crews are moving through hedgerows like infantry. They're doing the work of engineers. And you can see all this like in real time learning as they're coming down the peninsula there. That's giving them an advantage. And I think particularly interesting is that there are engagements between there are American independent tank battalions in the area. The 712th is one of the ones I'm writing about. So they're not from a division, they're independent, and they are coming up against, in this battle, actual German armor. They're coming up and proper German field guns, the kind of ones deployed by Das Reich, etc., etc. Whereas over to the east, when we talk about German armor, we're talking about Marders and Stugs, self-propelled guns. We're not talking about, until you get to the British and Canadian sector, you're not talking about the really good stuff. But there is one part of the American battlefield in late June, early July, where the Americans are encountering what I would call the good stuff. And not only the good stuff, the people who know how to use the good stuff as well. Because obviously the second Das Reich coming through Oradour-sur-Glane and Toul, they are quite effective at what they do on the ground. They are a competent division. And even when they're being used in these penny packets around La Haye-du-Puits, they are doing what they're doing really well. And I'm really grateful that they didn't get launched in fully into this sector here, because it's not going to change the Normandy. It's not going to change the outcome of the Normandy campaign, but it's going to possibly derail Bradley's thinking about Cobra, which derails this, which means all the next series of events maybe don't happen the way they did. So the key division, to go back to your question about the American forces, and the one that I've been grappling with, is the American 90th Division. As I said, they're the problem division. Because I'm a great lover of the Battle of the Falaise Gap, if you can love a battle. The 90th Division underperformed there. I think anyone who's been there can say that compared to the Poles on the Mace, compared to the Canadians in Saint-Lambert-City, the American 90th Division are not quite pulling their weight. Until eventually in September, I think it's maybe August, they get Van Fleet as their commanding officer. And then they become really good. It's those things when a football team changes coach, manager, and suddenly everything clicks. And all the players that hadn't been scoring goals start scoring goals, all that kind of stuff. Once the 90th Division get the right commander, it just goes like overnight, like immediately they become everything they had been trying to be. But in the Normandy campaign, they just can't seem to get things right. And there are loads of studies done at the time by people within the 90th Division, within the 8th Corps, trying to kind of go, why is this division underperforming?
All these, just to sort of bring us around to the overall picture here, we're talking in depth about certain divisions on the German side, on the American side, the type of fighting, how the experience at La Haye-du-Puits might have affected the 90th Division then going forward. As you mentioned, I think that's quite an interesting insight. Also, the importance of the, let's say, more capable German units being put into this battle in penny packets, especially the second SS Panzer. All these American divisions are functionally a part of the 8th Corps, right, which is under the 1st U.S. Army. This is why, just to orient our viewers a little bit, which is under Bradley, right? So this is why the connection, I think, that you rightly make, Paul, is such a tight one between what's happening at Saint-Lô, a little bit eastwards, and the planning for the big breakout that comes at Saint-Lô, and what's happening at La Haye-du-Puits, because they're part of the same big overarching formation. The top commanders are looking at both of these places. And I think that lends importance to this engagement at La Haye-du-Puits, which, of course, is why you're doing the work that you're doing, I would imagine. And on the German side, the units that we're talking about, various infantry divisions or parts of them, and the 2nd SS Panzer, they are part of the 7th Army, which is also struggling with bigger problems, of course, across a much wider front. And more specifically, I suppose, I think it's the 84th Corps, if I'm not mistaken, that is responsible for the area that encompasses La Haye-du-Puits. So here we have your kind of two organizations that are trying to oversee what's happening in La Haye-du-Puits. And these individual divisions we're talking about are a part of those. There is, as the battle goes on, because I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but I think I read that the US initially thought that taking the village of La Haye-du-Puits would take something like a few days. And it ends up taking something like 2 weeks or 12 days, something along those lines. And that is because of these difficulties, because of these hills, because of the bokage, because maybe of some difficulties in the performance of the 90th Division, if I trust in your research, Paul, since I'm not that familiar with the division. So I wanted to take a moment there just to get us, to reorient us all while we're in the midst of things. Matthias, I can see you're on the edge of your seat here to talk
very
to
excited,
us about,
exactly. Just reinforcing the point, Jesse, that you just made. I'm just concentrating on the Germans now because I know them better than the Americans. You always said 7th Army, that is absolutely right. 84 Corps, that's there. And that, of course, is under the famous guy of Dietrich von Koltitz, who is known as the savior of Paris. I mean, that later on, he's then arrested, of course, spent some time in a prison of war camp. Sometimes when you see pictures of him, he always looks like this slightly overweight, I wouldn't say clown, that's too much, but he doesn't look particularly military, even after the war. He goes back to his former headquarters in Paris, and the waiter sees him and he says, the moment he walked in, by his military posture, I can see it was him. So obviously he had something about him, but he doesn't look particularly impressive, slightly overweight. But actually, he's a very, very experienced commander. He won the Knight's Cross in the Low Countries in 1940, then fights on the Eastern Front. He knows how to do these things and how to fight, even though he doesn't look like it. But of course, the problem that he's facing, and Paul, you talked about, is the composition of the German forces as well. So you've got this corps. And when you just look at it, I don't want to run all through this in all its details, but you've got, for example, the 91st Division that was mentioned. You then have a number of battle groups. One battle group consisting of elements from the 91st Division, 243, and I think it's 265 Infantry Division. You then have the artillery component from 243 Division, which gets thrown in. You already talked about the artillery side. You then have the Montcastre area, which was defended by the 77th Infantry Division, and another battle group of a 353. In addition to all of that, you then have Das Reich that you talked about, which is not part of the Corps. It's an army reserve. And in addition to that, you also have the Fallschirmjäger, which, as far as I know, are seen as some kind of OKW reserve, but I might be wrong on this. But definitely they're not part of the Corps or but the Corps structure. So that in itself already shows you a little bit about the confusion on the German side as well. You always think there's always order because they're Germans. No, there isn't. It's all complete all over the place. It's confusing. They've got the battle group concept. They, in theory, know how to do that well. Someone like Koltitz will know how to do it. But if you have one of these understrength, not particularly well-trained divisions, how good are they really at doing this? So you can see things are just getting pushed into the front line because that's all you've got left. You've got something else happening somewhere else in the near vicinity. So now you've got other stuff happening further to the east. And you're basically just pushing troops in where you can. You're trying to hold the SS, so to speak, back because it's an army reserve. So that makes sense because that is the iron fist of that particular sector of the front. So that formation should be held back. You can put the other ones in there when it's bokage country. Okay, even Fallschirmjäger can do this there, fine, or boxed infantry divisions. But you can see it's getting really difficult. On top of everything, Paul, that you mentioned about numerical superiority, and in particular, of course, about material. I mean, air, you talked about this. That's a problem. The moment the Allies in the West don't have air, they get very, very, what's the right word? Grumpy, scared, frightened. But to the Germans, of course, the thing that really matters as well is either that, and of course, it's the artillery. And we've said this time and again on this podcast here, the one thing the Germans really hold in high regards during World War II from the enemy's armies, so not air, but armies, is the artillery. That is the big battle winner. The Germans see this, how good they really are. They've got nothing to put against that at that stage. And that's the problem that they're facing. So it's really, when you look at this, yeah, not looking all that good and well for the German side.
No, and your point about artillery is that there isn't much artillery available to Americans because it's all over
It's on the other
to
side.
east, getting ready for this sort of breakout from Saint-Lô, which is why the tank destroyer unit are essentially becoming the artillery arm, but they're also doing the work of the air power who aren't there because of the weather. So they're being overstretched. And I like what you said there about the German forces, because also I think in the Battle of La Haye-du-Puits, they're not following the script that the Allies have kind of got used to them following, which is the Allies move out a bit, the Germans hold a little bit, then the Germans counterattack, and then the Allies hit the German counterattack, and then they move. I mean, that's a very simple way of explaining it, but that's sort of, go back to Villa Bocage in the middle part of June. That's kind of the model there. But when you get to Saint-Lô, which I say isn't part of this discussion, the Germans, I think, have learnt from La Haye-du-Puits that, you know what, if you've got good high ground, don't come off it. Stay on the high ground. Where the Allies, make them come to you. And that is an absolute something that's happening in the La Haye-du-Puits battle. I think I'm not going to find the direct, someone's not going to make a phone call in the 84th Corps from La Haye-du-Puits and say, by the way, guys, if you just hold the ridges, it'll work really well. I'm not going to find that kind of smoking gun of like a direct link. But when you look at how the 29th Division and the 30th Divisions and things move out towards Saint-Lô, a couple of weeks later, you can absolutely see the Germans just aren't. They're not falling into the trap of coming off their ground, doing their counterattacks, and then getting smashed. We've been obsessed. Not me. We've been obsessed with these death or glory, suicidal charges north by the Germans in Normandy, by the 12th SS and things like that. And people get very excited about, oh look, they're pushing their Panthers up towards the beaches. And you look at it at a much wider level. They never work. They have initial success, and then, as you said there, artillery and air power always crushes these counterattacks. And I think the Battle of La Haye-du-Puits is both showing that the Germans could have fought a better campaign in Normandy if they hadn't been so committed to their stupid counterattacks. And the Allies are learning that just having a numerical advantage doesn't count. It's how you apply that numerical advantage, how you bring your forces to combat, and you basically solve the riddle of combined arms, which to me is, if there's one thing that all sides are trying to do in World War II, it's solve that mystery of how you integrate armor and artillery and infantry and air power into a smooth running organization. And when I'm with a tour group, for example, I always say to people, like a word association game, I'm going to say a general's name and you come up with adjectives to describe that general. So when I say something like Patton, they say aggressive, takes no prisoners, ivory handle pistols, blah, blah, blah. Bradley, people say conservative, steady, soldier, reliable, all that kind of stuff. Part of which I don't agree with. But Operation Cobra is really quite risky. It's quite bold. It doesn't really feel like a Bradley operation. Hergen Forest later on feels more Bradley-like to me. Aachen feels more like Bradley. But I think it's born out of desperation. It's born out of what he's seeing at Montcastre for the 90th Division, what he's seeing when he speaks to the divisional commander of the 79th Division as they're attacking Bloody Hill 84. And they start telling him, you know what, these Germans aren't just rolling over and letting us trundle forward. They're being really quite stubborn, and there's not that many of them. And I think Bradley's quite shocked by this, which is what I think, kind of partly why I think Operation Cobra comes into play a bit.
All this is connected to, one of the biggest questions that I was hoping that you'd answer on today's show, Paul, and which I think you have over the course of our chat here, is why did it take so long? Right? You have a much, much more powerful American force. They themselves think that it's going to take 2-3 days or whatever it is, and it ends up taking 11, 12, 13 days or whatever it is. So it's this combination of all these factors that you've been mentioning, and it's interesting that now you've got your hands on a couple of pieces of evidence from the German side that help try to explain what they were doing and thinking in those certain windows. One piece of information that struck me, a basic piece of information, but still I think it's, it reveals this pattern. The 79th Division loses 1,000 casualties on July 7th alone. I mean, we're that's very, very significant rate of loss. And as the other thing that struck me, I think, about this, why it was so difficult, another factor is the arrival of the 8th US Division later in the fighting. Because if I recall correctly, the original idea was, okay, you have these several US divisions, including the airborne, including the 82nd Airborne. And the idea is, right, we're going to seize this high ground, and that's basically going to be the battle, right? We're going to force the Germans out of the area by taking these 5+, let's call it that as a compromise solution, 5+ hills.
I like that.
Maybe that could be on the cover of the book. I don't know.
Several.
Exactly. Yeah.
A number of significant hills.
Exactly. So to take these hills, but because it takes them so long, the 82nd has to go. It's got to go somewhere else for preparation for another operation. And the 8th gets sent in, which, and I'll let you say a word about this in a moment, Paul, because you certainly know more about them than I do. Apparently, they have a very difficult time. They're not that experienced. Their commander, McMahon, is then dismissed, as far as I've been able to read. So it's this, I don't want to call it a perfect storm, because, I mean, the Americans win in the end, and there's not much doubt that they're going to win, I think. But there's almost like a perfect storm of factors making it harder for the Americans to achieve their objectives. The weather, the terrain, the bokage, the quality of the German armor that can be sent in by the Army Reserve. And you have this critical moment in the battle where an inexperienced American formation comes in and really struggles as well. So I don't know, is that a fair kind of breakdown in a way, Paul?
It is. And I'm struggling at the moment with that writer's dilemma of how much of the American 8th Division I bring into the story and how much I don't, because it's relevant, but then there's contextual stuff, because I've got to include the rest of that corps as well, and the fighting out of Carenton and towards Perrier and the villages. I'm like, is that part of the story? Is that connected to the story? I can't ignore it, but I don't want to spend too much time getting bogged down on that. But absolutely, yeah. And then when you see the terrain, there's a little, like they call it a donjon, little remains of a prison building, just sort of more than that, 7 or 8 miles east of La Haye-du-Puits, where you can climb up it. And the little information panels there are all about bird watching and stuff like that these days. But you can see it, and you can see basically it shows you the route the 8th come in, and like the 8th Corps coming in, because it gets confused because you've got the 8th Division and the 8th Corps, but the 8th Division are under the same situation as the 8th Corps have been coming down from the north. Is everything's seen by the Germans, and they're running pretty much straight into the elements of 2nd SS Panzer and all the units that we listed earlier that are kind of now pulling out, or sort of pulling out, falling back, pulling out, redeploying, and in language gets vague from the hills.
Advancing backwards, whatever.
Yeah, advancing backwards. And yeah, I'm on that, because I live in France. I'm also going to be including French voices, which I think is very important, because in all battles, there can be a tendency to just see a battlefield as an arena where armies engage, and the people who are there in the middle of it just seem to get whitewashed out of it. And in a list of archives in the Department of the Archives in Saint-Lô, I found a book mentioned, but the English title is The Little Surprises of Springtime, by a guy who was 12 at the time. And I saw the cover of the book online. It had a picture of a Fallschirmjäger helmet and a teddy bear. I'm like, what? And it's out of print for 20 years, self-published. But there was a copy on eBay, right? That cost me more to have it sent to me than it did to actually buy it. And I got this thing. And I read French, but I have to slow down a bit to read it, because I have to and there's always a word I don't know. And I go, okay, what that's. But I'm reading it and I'm just instantly excited, because this guy is one of those people who is describing things incredibly viscerally. And my prologue to my book is an account of a tank commander in the 712th Tank Battalion coming down off Montcastre when he actually thinks the battle is over. Sort of. And he's got another battle. 90th Division now have to kind of realign themselves and kind of almost bump up with the 8th Division. And the village just over to the east is, which, when I'm taking a tour there, people think I finished. And I stop in this village. Oh, by the way, just coming off the hill, they lose 200 more people in this village. And they go, what, these 7 houses? Yeah, pretty much. And this tank commander, long story short, he loses 2 feet during he gets 1 foot shot off. A round, I think it's a 2nd Panzer artillery piece. A round goes through his German tank and takes his left foot off. He battles on in this hedgerow for 48 hours with a couple of other survivors of his tank crew and a 90 Division guy who's there with him. Then at a later point, when friendly fire comes in, he loses his other foot and he earns a Distinguished Service Cross and all this stuff. And I've got the entire account written by insanely good. And there's a brilliant guy, an American, who wrote about the 712th, who interviewed all these guys like 30 years ago, which is just fantastic for me to be able to take all this stuff and use it. And it's, every tank is coming through the hedgerow. Each description is vivid of who's jumping out the top, who's going out underneath. And then this French kid is walking through the same battlefield a day later and is describing the helmets beside the tanks, the rotting inside of it. There's German helmets, American helmets with human hair and flesh inside them. And okay, you've got to be careful how much of that kind of stuff you put into a book. You don't want to kind of upset people. But for me, it did the job of explaining just how primeval, how terrible this battle got, because you two are military historians, right? So you want to know the whys and whats in terms of why does this unit perform? Why does this commander move his force left at this hill, not right at this hill? And I'm trying to do that, but I also want to kind of get to this sort of philosophical thing to answer your question, Jesse, of why did it take 2 weeks? There's a British journalist who's one of these guys camped out there thinking that something's going to happen there, and he doesn't essentially get the story he wants, because in the end, it happens at Cobra, the other end of the road. He writes vividly about a guy in the town of La Haye-du-Puits after the end of the battle. And this is one of the 79th Division guys, I think. By location, it has to be. Well, I say it has to be. Historians, it has to be. 90% chance. Probably ought to be. But this guy, who's not wearing a helmet, is standing against a stone wall and he's bashing his head against a wall and blood is pouring across his face, down over his nose. It looks like he's broken his nose. And the journalist calls over a couple of medics and they whack him in the back of a Dodge ambulance. This guy's taken off. And I'm like, this is significant. And then I'm starting to look into other archives, and there are multiple accounts of people physically hitting a wall and mentally hitting a wall. This is what caused this battle to slow down. It was a lot of people's near breaking point. And I think that's why this battle essentially is worth uncovering. Yes, there's all these, the Americans are using things, they're using tank destroyers, the Germans aren't counterattacking, but there's this human interest of a battle. There's an 82nd account, one of the guys who fights for Hill 95, and he's talking about, and he wrote this account years later, I never see July the 4th, Independence Day, the same way, because I spent the latter part of that day picking up my dead friends and putting them on the back of a deuce and a half like cordwood to go off to be buried. And he was one of, I think only 11 men from his company survived. I don't know what strength they were at when they went into this battle, because they had obviously not had replacements since June the 6th, but let's say they were at half strength. Let's say there was 60 or 70 guys. But if 11 walk off that battlefield, that's significant. And for the life of me, I don't know why this battle hasn't been examined in any level of detail before. I think it's just because it's like the shininess of the Saint-Lô battle has somehow got people's imagination and some of the folklore stories until me, really.
This podcast episode and your forthcoming book on the topic. I think that human side, which is something that we also try to integrate into the podcast in our other episodes if we can. It's an important one, and I think it's an important one to keep in mind, no matter what one's specific interest in military history might be. So I'm glad that you took some time to talk about that, and I'm glad that that's going to feature in your book as well, in your forthcoming book. I also think that that's a kind of a good theme for us to wrap up our discussion for today. However, I'd be remiss if I didn't give Matthias the final word here. Matthias, what are your closing thoughts on our chat with Paul today?
Well, I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Just want to come back to one of the last sentences, Paul, that you just said. You said, well, you don't understand why no one's actually looked at this battle before. And that's quite true, because in the run-up to this episode, when I was doing a bit of reading, I didn't know too much about this, I have to confess. But it is, and as you explained, it's a bit like a magnifying glass of the Normandy campaign, isn't it? You've got could repeat this all now again. So we've got the weather, you've got the terrain, the bokage, you've got the different nationalities, the different formations with their inherent strengths and weaknesses, and all these things. So it is like a magnifying glass of the Normandy campaign. Of course, also, as you explained, there's a bigger picture to all of this, which means that probably both sides also fight in particular ways. And all that is really important, bringing together the pure military history side of things, but also the human element, as you both have now said, is of course important. So sometimes we just take a step back. I always call it the cold eye of the general staff officer. Being general staff trained, I can do that quite well. But there is the other element. There is the other element as well, of course. And military history and the real history is all of it, isn't it? You can't just take the one away from it. If you say, what is military history? Well, we've really moved on from this definition that military history is only the big battles. It's everything to do within the context of the military at war, peacetime, civilians. You talked about children. All that is officially part of military history. And sometimes we tend to overlook this. So I'm really, really grateful that you brought that in as well. Thank you. And that is me done.
Right. In that case, I would like to thank you, Paul, very much for accepting our invitation and coming on the podcast and talking about this. I mean, okay, look, the idea of a forgotten XYZ is sometimes overused, but I think La Haye-du-Puits, let's say, is an overlooked part of the Normandy campaign. I think we're safe in saying that. So thanks again for coming on today. Folks out there, if you want more of Paul, you can find him on the World War II TV YouTube channel. You can also keep an eye out for his book in the works whenever it's going to come out. And you can find him as a tour guide on the battlefields of Normandy in real life. So that's it for our episode today. Listeners and viewers out there, if you like what we do here on the podcast today and or generally, we'd be very happy if you decided to support the podcast. You can do that by going to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. There you can even get some exclusive content. If you would like, you can even try out that exclusive content in our war room for free for a little while using the code Deep Dark Woods. So thanks to everybody, Paul and listeners and Matthias, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
I call that age. There we go.
Yeah, I don't know.
At least we got hair. That helps.
I noticed. Yeah, I do for now, but it is slowly abandoning me. Very slowly. I'm going to have to adopt a cap like Paul there if things keep up.